Hi there. Today we are going to look at how to answer the prose essay question, which is one of three essays that you'll be asked to write on the AP Literature and Composition exam. So let's get started. While reading or before you read the prompt carefully. Convert the statement in the prompt into a question to ensure that your response is focused. Here's an example. If the prompt reads something like this, then, in a well-written essay, analyze how mystery uses literary elements and techniques to convey Dina's complex response to these places. Changing it into a question simply looks something like this. What literary elements and techniques does mystery use to convey Dina's complex response to these places? Also, you'll need to figure out how is her response complex. So these are some things to just remember to do so that you are focused on the proper details as you begin to read. When you do begin to read, you are going to be annotating details that relate to the prompt in terms of the literary techniques that they refer to or any other part of the prompt that you're asked to write about. And this is called reading with a purpose. You are reading for a particular purpose, gathering specific information that will help you answer the question. You also want to pay attention to shifts or a shift or shifts in the passage. This is the College Board asking you to identify or testing you on the idea that you can understand how a writer structures their writing. So you look for shifts. A shift can be in a number of different ways. It could be a shift in tone, a shift in location or setting, a shift in the main idea, a shift in focusing on one character versus another. There's a lot of different ways that a shift can appear. You do want to pay attention to those because the shifts will determine your body paragraphs. Because we write these essays chronologically, wherever you have a shift will determine the area of focus for each of those body paragraphs. And we'll take a look at that an example of that shortly. Around 80% of the prose passages that you're ask you to focus on either characters or setting, predominantly characters. Things or details to look for in these areas are, for character, we'd look for details about the character's appearance, characters' personality traits, what are their desires, their struggles, their hopes, their dreams, etc. We look for details about major conflict or tension the character faces. Details about the relationship to other characters. Is that relationship between those characters healthy, strained, altered in some way? Details that highlight comparisons or contrasts to other characters. In terms of setting, we look for these types of details. Details about the physical surroundings. We also pay attention to time period, location, objects within the location that may seem significant. Details about the location that affect the characters in some way. So, for instance, is the location reflective of the values of that character, or do they contrast the values of that character in some way? So those are some things to look for when looking for details about either character or setting. In terms of prose writers use a particular type of or group of literary techniques. It's like any artist. If a artist is a painter, they're going to use paintbrushes and a canvas and paints. Writers of prose are going to use different tools. They're going to use things like selection of details, point of view, first person, second person, third person. They're going to look for diction or word choice. They're going to use dialogue, tone, imagery, figurative language, and also sentence types, the length of sentences, sometimes the punctuation. These are techniques that you want to look for writers of prose. There may be some others, but these are the predominant ones. Identifying complexity is something that you'll be asked to do with each and every question or prompt. Complexity can be represented in a number of different ways. For example, you could have inconsistent behaviors of characters. That might represent complexity. Competing or conflicting choices that puts the character's beliefs and values into question. Contradiction to thoughts, speech, and or actions, or shifts in thoughts, speech, or actions. Things that change from one part of the passage to the next might represent the complexity of the passage. Contrasts or literary foils. Two opposing characters who have different viewpoints on different things might create complexity. Changes in character circumstances, perspectives, motives, relationships, choices, actions, and/or speech. Any fluctuation, anything that causes tension, anything that causes conflict, typically will be representing complexity, and you want to look for that as you read. When I write my introduction paragraph, I use this acronym, sneaky narrators tell lies. And the S and the N, the T and the L represent different elements that help my students remember the elements to include in your introduction paragraph. So once I've read my passage and I've gathered my details and I've done some annotation, I need to start my introduction paragraph. And what I do is I typically summarize the situation of the passage. 1 or 2 sentences would be sufficient. I then identify the narration in the passage, first person, second person, or third person perspective. I identify the literary techniques that the author uses and how those techniques work toward answering the question in the prompt. And then I identify the lesson for humanity that the passage teaches us. Now, I always say that this is not a requirement on the AP Literature rubric. However, it's a level of sophistication that I feel if students include this, it shows a different level of an additional level of interpretation, which I think is important for anyone to write. Okay, let's take a look at a practice passage. This is from a previous AP exam, and this is taken from an excerpt from Thomas Hardy's Mayor of Casterbridge from 1886. Michael Henchard and his daughter, Elizabeth Jane, are reunited after years of estrangement. During this separation, Henchard has risen from poor seasonal farm worker to wealthy mayor of a small country town, while Elizabeth has supported herself by waiting on tables at a tavern. It says, read the passage carefully, paying particular attention to tone, word choice, and selection of detail. Compose a well-written essay in which you analyze Hardy's portrayal of the complex relationship between the two characters. So I initially underlined important parts of the passage, important parts of the prompt, and I'm going to convert those into a question. So I underlined these parts, and then here's my question. How does Hardy use tone, word choice, and selection of detail to portray the complex relationship between the two characters? I also need to identify what makes the relationship complex. And here's a reminder, when writing about the complexity, try not to use the word complex in your thesis. Instead, explain the complexity, identify the complexity. The AP reader doesn't want to see you simply reuse the prompt language. They want you to answer the question. So pay attention to that. Let's read through, and I'm going to underline certain details. Now, there are probably more here than that I will underline that pertain to answering this question, but it will give you an idea of how to walk through the prompt, walk through the passage, and underlining key details that specifically relate to the relationship between these two characters. Okay, so let's just read. Of all the enigmas which ever confronted a girl, there can have been seldom one like that which followed Henchard's announcement of himself to Elizabeth as her father. He had done it in an ardor and an agitation which had half carried the point of affection with her, yet behold, from the next morning onwards his manner was constrained as she had never seen it before. So I noted about his manner being constrained. If his manner is constrained, it suggests there's some tension between the two, and she may be affected by that, hence relating to the relationship between the two. The coldness soon broke out into open chiding. One grievous failing of Elizabeth's was her occasional pretty and picturesque use of dialect words, those terrible marks of the beast to the truly genteel. I also underlined the coldness soon broke out into open chiding. If he's scolding her openly, then that is going to be a detail I want to pay attention to because it must be affecting the relationship. It was dinner time. They never met except at meals, and she happened to say when he was rising from table, wishing to show him something, "If you'll bide where you be a minute, father, I'll get it." "Bide where you be," he echoed sharply. "Good God, are you only fit to carry wash to a pig trough, that ye use such words as those?" Again, I underlined this particular piece of dialogue, which implies his harsh treatment towards his daughter. Hence, also a detail important about identifying or informing us about the complexity of the relationship. She reddened with shame and sadness. Another detail related to the complexity or the complex relationship. It's showing that there is a strained relationship between these two characters. I meant stay where you are, father, she said in a low, humble voice. I ought to have been more careful. He made no reply and went out of the room. The sharp reprimand was not lost upon her, and in time it came to pass that for Fay she said succeed, that she no longer spoke of Dumbledores, but of humblebees, no longer said of young men and women that they walked together, but that they were engaged, that she grew to talk of Greggles as wild hyacinths, that when she had not slept, she did not quaintly tell the servants next morning that she had been Hagrid, but that she had suffered from indigestion. So all of these things I underline because these are efforts by the daughter to try and appease the father, making, again, details that would inform me about their relationship, because it's suggesting about how she's responding to his criticisms of her type of dialect that she uses. These improvements, however, are somewhat in advance of the story. Henchard, being uncultivated himself, was the biggest critic that the fair girl could possibly have had of her own lapses. Really slight now, for she read omnivorously. A gratuitous ordeal was in store for her in the matter of her handwriting. So I'm going to pause there for 1 second. I'm going to underline some additional details in this paragraph, and I'll get to those in 1 second. But I also want to point out here too a particular shift in the scene. So that in here on line 35 or 36, there is a shift in the scene with the mayor and a business associate. So the beginning of this particular passage from lines 1 to 35 basically focuses on the conversation between Henchard and his daughter and his criticism of her language or dialect. And then there's a shift. There's this new scene that's introduced in line 36, where there's a shift in the scene with the mayor now with the business associate. So we'll continue to read that, and we'll gather some, as I have done, I've gathered some more evidence, again, relating to the relationship. A gratuitous ordeal was in store for her in the matter of her handwriting. She was passing the dining room door one evening, and she had an occasion to go in for something. It was not till she had opened the door that she knew that the mayor was there in the company of a man with whom he transacted business. Here, Elizabeth Jane, he said, looking round at her, just write down what I tell you, a few words in agreement for me and this gentleman to sign. I am a poor tool with a pen. Be jound and so be I, said the gentleman. She brought forth blotting book, paper, and ink, and sat down. Now then, an agreement entered into this 16th day of October. Write that first. She started the pen in an elephantine march across the sheet. It was a splendid, round, bold hand of her own conception, a style that would have stamped a woman as Minerva's own in more recent days. But other ideas reigned then. Henchard's creed was that proper young girls wrote ladies' hand. Nay, he believed that bristling characters were as innate and inseparable a part of refined womanhood as sex itself. So here he is now criticizing not only her dialect from the previous section, he's criticizing her handwriting. Hence, when instead of scribbling like the Princess Ida, in such a hand as when a field of corn bows all its ears before the roaring east, Elizabeth Jane produced a line of chain shot and sandbags. He reddened in angry shame for her, and peremptorily saying, never mind, I'll finish it, dismissed her there and then. So I underlined another detail, which again shows the relationship between the two. It shows his harsh treatment of his daughter. Her considerate disposition had become a pitfall to her now, and she was, it must be admitted, sometimes provokingly and unnecessarily willing to saddle herself with manual labors. She would go to the kitchen instead of ringing, not to make Phoebe come up twice. She went down on her knees, shovel in hand, when the cat overturned the coal scuttle. Moreover, she would persistently thanked the parlor maid for everything, till one day, as soon as the girl was gone from the room, Henchard broke out with, "Good God, why doesn't leave off thanking that girl as if she were a goddess born? Don't I pay her £12 a year to do things for ye?" Elizabeth shrank so visibly at the exclamation that he became sorry a few minutes after, and said that he did not mean to be rough. These domestic exhibitions were the small protruding needle rocks, which suggested rather than revealed what was underneath. But his passion had less terror for her than his coldness. The increasing frequency of the latter mood told her the sad news that he disliked her with a growing dislike. The more interesting that her appearance and manners became under the softening influences which she could now command, and in her wisdom did command, the more she seemed to estrange him. So I underlined some of those details as well, again, informing us about the relationship. So typically for each of the sections, you want to have at least 3 to 4 examples of support for each of the sections, because that will show a fairly good, solid representation of your argument. So here's how we might take this information now and kind of organize and write a thesis with the associated claims for the body paragraphs. So if I looked at all this information, a thesis statement that answers the question that is in the prompt might read something like this. Through the use of specific details and word choice, the daughter's thoughtful and heartfelt attempts to please her father are met with condescension and contempt, suggesting that sometimes people place an unnecessary level of importance on adhering to societal expectations. So that would be a thesis statement that answers the question because it tells us the details or the techniques that are being used, and it defines and identifies why this relationship is complex. She is attempting to please her father, and it's met with condescension and contempt. The first claim for body paragraph number 1 would read something like this. In the opening section of the excerpt, Hardy establishes the father's sense of contempt by providing details about the daughter's action and speech, because that is the purpose of the first section. In the second section, Hardy continues to illustrate the father's harsh treatment of his daughter while providing details of a meeting with a business associate. And that might be our claim number 2. And then I would pull in several examples from that section. Let's put this all together. Here's an introduction and a first body paragraph for this particular response. In the excerpt from Thomas Hardy's Mayor of Casterbridge, and through a third-person narration, a father and daughter are reunited after years of separation and must learn to adjust to one another. So what I've done is I've included the title and author, I've included the point of view, which is a third-person narration, and I've included a short summary of the passage. That's all you need. I then address the techniques. However, through the use of specific details and word choice, the daughter's thoughtful and heartfelt attempts to please her father are met with condescension. So that's how the techniques work toward answering the question. And here's my lesson. Suggesting that sometimes people place an unnecessary level of importance on adhering to societal expectations. That's my introduction paragraph. Here's what my body paragraph for section 1 might sound like. In lines 1 through 29, Hardy establishes the father's sense of condescension by providing details about the father's reaction to the daughter's less than proper speech. So I start with a claim that identifies the line numbers or paragraphs, lists the techniques used, and identifies the purpose for that section. And then I move on to presenting my first example. Using a transition, initially, Hardy establishes so TR represents a transition. They could be simple transitions as long as they're there to accurately connect the ideas together. And TE stands for textual evidence. And textual evidence is what we use in our evidence and commentary sections. Once we provide textual evidence, we have to explain the purpose or the effect of that evidence as it relates to the claim. So that's what you'll see in this paragraph. So TR, transition, initially, the first one, Hardy establishes the father as someone whose manner was constrained and whose coldness broke out to open chiding. So those you remember from our our annotation process. Once I do that, I explain the purpose and the effect of that textual evidence. This choice of detail establishes the father's insensitive and distant manner towards his daughter, which sets the stage for his condescending comments about his daughter's chosen dialect, which are seen as terrible marks of the beast to the truly genteel. Through these details, again, I'm going to start with another connector word or transition phrase. Hardy also indicates the class difference, because this is also the purpose or the effect of that detail. The class difference between the two, alluding to the father's embarrassment at his daughter's less than proper speech. Moving on to our next piece of textual evidence. Hardy then provides various examples of inappropriate words the daughter uses, of which her father so vehemently disapproves, noting how she would make it a point to say succeed instead of fey, or that a man or woman were engaged as opposed to saying that they walked together. Here, the daughter is making great efforts in order to win her father's approval. However, it seems to have very little effect, and her father seems to not only notice, but he continues to find other fault in other things that she does, such as the way in which she writes. In this first section, this first section establishes the father's insensitive ways and illustrates the daughter's meaningful attempts to bridge the gap that exists between them. And that's my introduction paragraph and my first body paragraph. And then I would move on to the next section. So that should give you a good understanding of how to approach the question 2 prose essay. Again, one of 3 essays that you'll be required to write for the AP English and English Literature and Composition exam. Thanks.